Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Julia Harrison. I'm director of the Frost Centre for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies, and I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to the third talk in our The North at Trent 2013 lecture series. It's been a very successful series, and it's a real pleasure to have Whitney Lackenbauer here as our final speaker for the series. I'd like to recognize a couple of people in the audience. Our VP External Relations, Julie Davis, has joined us this evening. The Dean of Graduate Studies, where are you, Joan? I can't say it. There she is. She just walked in. Joan Sangster is here. And I would also like to make a special, extend a special welcome to John and Sheila Grant, who are strong supporters of all that we do in the Frost Centre in Canadian Studies. And Sheila has also written on the area and the topic near and dear to tonight's lecture. So we'll be hearing from Sheila at the end, as she'll have a chance to thank Whitney at the end. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors, the Frost Centre for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies, the Roberta Bondar Fellowship Fund for Northern and Polar Studies, and our first speaker was the current Roberta Bondar Fellow, and the NIN Fund from the President's Office have all generously supported the series, and it's been a real success. I'd also like to say that this is the third North Lecture series that I have hosted and organized as director of the Frost Centre, and it will be my last, as I am stepping down as director at the end of June, but I really feel that it's been a real important contribution to the topic of Northern Studies at Trent, and it's been a real pleasure to be part of it. And this is a perfect talk to end this evening. I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Heather Nicol from the Department of Geography, and a close friend and associate and colleague of Whitney Lackenbauer, to introduce him tonight. It was Heather that first asked that we might invite Whitney to be an adjunct professor in the Frost Centre, which was, I think, is going to be a good relationship for us. So I'd like to invite Heather now to officially introduce Whitney.
Yeah. You may not recognize this man in the room. I mentioned him, and I'm so happy to see a lot of students from the geography department out this evening, and I had mentioned to students that perhaps had never actually met Dr. Lackenbauer before, but perhaps were familiar with his work, that there's probably very few pictures of him that exist that don't have him covered in frost. This evening he is not covered in frost. We took him down to Rio Gusto and warmed him up a bit before we brought him in to talk to you. I'm really pleased to have Whitney come and talk to us this evening. I've known Whitney for probably about 7 years. I mean, it's Winnipeg. 40 below. You were pretty frozen there too. And he's a wonderful colleague. He's comes to us from St. Jeromes University, which is basically part of in the University of Waterloo. And he's an associate professor and the chair of the history department. So he comes with some sort of pretty weighty tailwind behind him. He's also the co-chair of the Monk School for Global Affairs and the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation for Arctic Peoples and for their Arctic Peoples and Security program. So he's a really busy guy. I don't think I've ever talked to Whit where he doesn't have too many things on his plate. I, in fact, have coerced him, and all of you students here should know that he's been coerced into going out after, maybe post-reception, for post-reception beer, if any of you would like to come, simply because it turns out he does not have to pull an all-nighter tonight, right? Something got canceled, and so you may have one night where you can get some, a couple hours sleep. But this is sort of indicative of the kind of life he leads. He's constantly in the field. He's a passionate, or writing about the field that he's been in. He's a passionate historian for the Canadian North. He's a prolific author. He's written, I won't even read the numerous books that he's written off, but I will plug his most recent, which is just the icing on the cake of a series, not just of books, but also of articles and numerous writings. And his most recent book that we're all really looking forward to is The Canadian Ranger, The Living History, because this is kind of our life's work for Whitney right now as part of his larger Canadian Rangers project. And Holly's work is exciting and interesting, but I think this, for me, certainly is one of the most interesting and exciting projects that he's done, because he's broken ground in this area of the Canadian Rangers and brought them to our attention. And in fact, we'll be talking about, I won't give you any spoiler on his lecture tonight, which is really on the impact of the military on the Inuit, in which the Canadian Rangers program is part of. So, he is Canada's expert and authority in terms of a historian of the Canadian Rangers. And it's just an incredibly exciting body of work. But his current research in general includes Arctic sovereignty and security practices since the Second World War, histories of the Joint Arctic Weather Station program, and the distant early warning line, or the dew line, and also community-based histories in partnership with Indigenous peoples in the North and with heritage societies in the North. He's traveled extensively in the Canadian Arctic with the Rangers, but Whit told me he was almost killed just before this, so that's why he wasn't looking too happy. He got just missed by a water truck, right? If that water had spilled, if the truck hadn't got to the water, whatever, he would have been more frozen here. And he's certainly a passionate advocate for increased awareness of Arctic issues among Southern Canadians. In fact, we had a little chat earlier this week, and I was saying to Whit that I thought that, just talking about what we were doing, that I could see my sort of role as not necessarily influencing any Arctic policy, but certainly trying to educate people. And this is where you just jumped on the wagon. I was the other end of the phone, but I could just hear him, light up and say, but that's what I do. This is, in a sense, what he's the most passionate about, is bringing really realistic and new and authentic visions and versions of the North, really authored by people in the North to Southerners so they can better understand. He also is, and I think this is really important, he's a true interdisciplinarian. He works across the board with everybody. I'm a geographer, with a historian, a partner in crime is Robert Hubert, who of course you don't see eye to eye with as a political scientist, but still between political scientists and historians and geographers and anthropologists.
International law.
Yes, international law. Yeah, absolutely. Just a true interdisciplinarian, and I think that really reflects his vision and his version of the Arctic and Northern studies. So I think we're really, really lucky to have him speak. I know we're in for a treat because Whitney's very high energy. We wouldn't feed him real coffee at dinner. He had to have decaffeinated. Goodness knows what would happen. And so I'm just looking, so forward to hearing you talk.
Well, thanks for the very overly generous introduction, Heather. Thanks to Julie as well for the kind invitation to deliver this talk as part of the North at Trent lecture series, sponsored by the Frost Center. Really great treat to be here, to be sure. And I've adjusted things up a bit. I was going to speak on almost more of a stock talk that I've given for the last few years on the intersection between sovereignty, security, and stewardship in the North. But I'm going to focus in on a little bit of a tighter topic tonight and use this opportunity to look at the intersection between Northerners' national defense and sovereignty. For those of us who follow the news, we'll understand how this fits within the logic of Stephen Harper and his government, how this is very much front and center with a lot of the imagery that we as Southern Canadians are consuming about the North. And I want to look at how that plays out historically. As Heather mentioned, over the last decade, I've been really blessed to spend a lot of time in the Canadian Arctic. And I think the most interesting part has been this work that I've done with the Canadian Rangers. I've been fortunate. I've literally got to travel with them from coast to coast to coast, and to experience a distinction that some of the Rangers said to me, Whitney, some people travel to the North. You've got the opportunity to travel in the North. And there's a very different mindset that you come away with. Whether you're squishing through the boggy tundra, waking up on the shores of Hudson Bay, eastern shores in Inukjuak and Nunavik in northern Quebec, realizing that the Arctic isn't this realm of perpetual ice and snow, that in the summer, it's quite a colorful place. Bombing around on snowmobiles, you know, when the state of water is frozen so it almost resembles land, right here on the Labrador Sea, off the coast of Labrador on the Atlantic, in the background with an island that looks like a great mountain to many of us. Realizing that the methodologies I use are often best suited to interviews, whether they're undertaken on the trail or in cabins, poring over maps and over coffee and the copious amounts of Coke and other pop that people drink up north, or of course while ice fishing. You know, here it's about 12:30 in the afternoon in Tuktoyaktuk in January, different times of the year. Or of course, munching on some raw seal, not just our former Governor General, right, who likes to eat the raw seal liver. For those of you who want to try it someday, it almost tastes like you're just drinking your bloody nose. But an interesting texture to you anyways. It's warm and fills you up with some warmth for sure. You know, in the other cases, going out and chatting with people while they're building snow houses. Igloos, obviously something very important. Heck, them even going and volunteering me to go spend a night alone in one of these, right? A loaded .303 rifle there in the cold trap, just in case a polar bear became curious and decided to pull its way in, but they told me they hadn't seen a polar bear there for years, so I was okay. And then saying to me, Whitney, you know, we're up here in the Arctic, and here's a little willow branch. Why do I need this? Well, you're sleeping in an Arctic. You need to wake up every couple of hours and poke holes in your igloo. Poke holes in an igloo? What do you mean? All I've got is a little tiny, you know, couple of survival candles, and that's it to warm this. Well, over the course of the night, it'll probably thaw out from the candles and can potentially freeze in, and you may suffocate. And people say to me, how did you know to wake up every couple of hours, Whitney? Tell somebody they're going to suffocate if they don't wake up every couple of hours, and I assure you I was on top of it. So people definitely setting me up for opportunities to witness firsthand the intersection between the official sovereignty agenda that's coming out of Ottawa and the realities on the ground for Northerners. And that's why I think the Canadian Rangers are a really fascinating way to jump in to my topic for tonight. Right? In the case of the Canadian Rangers, you have Northerners serving as reservists in the Canadian Forces, showing the flag for Canada. And on the one hand, we might celebrate their participation. Indeed, the residents of the three territories and the northern regions of the provinces, places like Nunavik and Nunatsiavut, serve in the Canadian Forces in rates far beyond Southern Canadians. It's really remarkable, about 7 times or 8 times the average of participation in our military, right? Despite the fact that we know the baggage of colonialism that's part of our nation's history. As the key military presence in the North, we might celebrate this grassroots organization as a representative and proportionate way to exercise our sovereignty and security. Or we might, as commentators like my friend Rob Hubert, the political scientist, suggest that we should lament the fact that the Rangers are pretty much all that we have in this unguarded northern frontier. That our north is in danger because the Russians are aggressive in their rhetoric and demonstrations of military capabilities, not to mention the Chinese and the European Union, right, lurking around, looking to our north. The US, our consummate love-hate relationship with Uncle Sam, right, who want to steal our Northwest Passage, and so on, right? Much of it's simple alarmism, but also very telling. And certainly the way that we conceptualize our country, the way that we orient ourselves, really influences how we set priorities. I think as Southern Canadians, we typically think about our North as a there rather than a here. And our politicians, the media, have once again to return to this rhetoric of the Arctic as this resource-rich frontier that we're going to either lose or use or lose, as if it's some empty economic and military space that needs our southern attention or it's going to slip away. And I was up on Ellesmere Island, right, the northernest tip of Canada, a couple of times in 2010. And if no other experience forced me to think about Canada, this really did force me to reorient my map, because everything is south from Canadian Forces Station Alert at the tip of Ellesmere. But as far as I was from the political heartland, I was directly tied to the practices of the Canadian state, right? Alert is a military installation, and we'd stayed on Resolute on Little Cornwallis Island, which was created in the 1950s when government officials moved Inuit from Quebec to the far north to try and liberate them from the food pressures that they were facing down south, right? Always a relative concept. And it's a sad story, and one that historians like Sheila Grant have written a great deal about. So we need to also think about the Arctic, the North, as a homeland, This map, laying out the various northern peoples living in the circumpolar world, reminds us of a couple of things. First of all, we need to place Canada within a broader circumpolar context. And we also need to remember that our southern mindsets and geostrategic calculations and our economic concerns are not always the most appropriate focal points. But when we find ourselves caught up in an alleged polar race, as we read about in the popular media, when our politicians tell us we need to act decisively or we're going to lose our northern inheritance in a circumpolar world that is being transformed by climate change, right, we take pause. Crisis is a very powerful concept. It suggests that there's no time for normal political exchanges, right? It demands action, particularly when it is cast in terms of sovereignty and security. Well, as an historian, of course, I am predisposed to ask, what has happened in the past? How will these practices affect Canadians before I jump into these current debates and start offering opinions? Do we really face the perfect storm, right, that Rob Hubert suggests we're facing in the Arctic? When I mention history, when I mobilize history in my public debates with Rob, he dismisses my evidence, suggesting it's moot, right? Melting sea ice, commercial ships, new strategic threats place not only Canadian, but Northerners' interests in jeopardy. This is why, he says, we need intensive and immediate military investment to improve our capabilities. If any of you are familiar with my work, you'll know I certainly support efforts to increase our military capabilities in the Arctic, but I'm certainly much more cautious about justifying that by saying the changes taking place are completely unprecedented. My response to Rob is the perfect storm has already come. It came in the 1950s. It was a product of Cold War military interests that opened up the region to Southern influence like nothing before. And as journalist and documentary filmmaker Kevin McMahon put it, it came in the form of boxes. The pretext for this bombardment of boxes was sovereignty and security. But the effects were more sweeping. They were cultural, they were social, they were economic, they were political, they were environmental, and these effects are with us today. But Southern Canadians tend to forget. Our interests in the North tend to be very episodic, and we have been very apt to forget the region once the sovereignty crises go and abate, as they always seem to do. Canadians get whipped into a frenzy, feeling that we're going to lose our North. When that threat disappears, we can slip back into apathy. Northerners do not have that luxury. And if my travels in the North have taught me anything, it's the centrality of relationships. So what is the history of the military's relationship with the North? What is Northerners' relationship with the military? A historian, Ken Eyre, once quipped that the military has influenced the North more than the North has influenced the military. A really brilliant observation. So what have these influences been? Let's go back to the beginning. Of course, Inuit and other northern peoples had been in the North long before the first European explorers arrived. We all know that these European explorers, like Franklin and so on, for all their bravado, right, were newcomers to the Arctic. They proved that, sure, they could go out there and plant flags, but they had a lot to learn if they actually wanted to live in the region, rather than just go and claim it for some distant sovereign and hopefully be able to sneak back to London to get the applause of the Queen and all their titles. For its part, Canada inherited the islands of the high Arctic archipelago from Britain in 1880, not because we particularly wanted them. Some American mining interests and British mining interests went and were asking questions about whether they could set up a mine. Over in London, the Brits said, we don't really want to deal with this file. Why don't we just transfer this territory over to Canada? We didn't know what we were receiving. Britain really didn't know what they were giving, to borrow the wonderful phrase of Gordon Smith, one of my historical mentors on this topic. And what Canada proceeded to do for the next quarter century was simply sit on its Arctic. Little to no thought given to the Inuits and other northern peoples, apart from the few trading posts that extended into the region and the missionaries that eventually followed. The Klondike Gold Rush provoked the first flexing of state authority to defend what was all of a sudden now a resource frontier, not just furry resources now. You know, the glitter could actually be gold. The Mounties headed north. Small military field force followed them, all to show the flag. Indigenous peoples were dramatically affected, as scholars like Charlene Porsild and Julie Cruikshank have shown. but they were treated as observers by these throngs of gold-struck Southerners who poured into the region. But soon after it began, for all the gold that came out of the Klondike, like many resource rushes, it soon disappointed its boosters. Southerners began their withdrawal. Dawson City went from being the biggest Canadian city west of Winnipeg to slipping into being sort of a quiet town. Yukon slipped back into relative obscurity in the Southern imagination, right? Just kept alive in the books of Jack London and the poems of Robert Service. Well, the government sent official missions to the Arctic to explore, to collect customs duties and licensing fees from whalers in the early 20th century. Really the first assertion of Canadian authority in Arctic waters. But certainly all a very modest, not a very robust, continuous government presence. Right? The Mounties asserted legal authority over the Inuit, as careful and very brilliant work by Sheila Grant and Ken Coates and Bill Morrison has shown. But it was still predicated on the idea that Inuit were best left as Inuit. Right? The state had no interest in drawing northern peoples into the larger Canadian political project at this point. Foreign claims still had to be settled. Our claims, particularly the Arctic islands, were still very tenuous. Right? We didn't know what the Brits had transferred to us. It wasn't only British explorers that had been operating and exploring around there. They didn't have any monopoly on activity in the archipelago. So Canadian negotiators reached agreements with the Danes, paid off the Norwegians, convinced American scientists sponsored by the US Navy to go and follow our rules. As a result, our sovereignty over our land areas, our terrestrial sovereignty, was pretty much settled by the early 1930s. And their Mounties in their scarlet tunics when they were appearing for photographs, usually in the middle of winter, of course, they wore caribou skin jackets, they weren't idiots. Right? It was the Mounties that were our human flagpoles in the high Arctic. Little thought was given to the place of northern peoples in support of Canadian sovereignty at this point in time. And of course, little to no thought about any military presence. Right between the wars, some of you will know the famous phrase by Senator Raoul Donderon, Canada's a fireproof house far from flammable materials. Right, we're a distant northern country, insulated from European and Asian crises by geography. What more insulated place than that frigid Arctic? Well, during the global inferno that was the Second World War, North America no longer seemed to be insulated. Canadians still considered the Arctic to be a natural defensive barrier, but the Americans were really concerned about Alaska and the overland and air routes to their northernmost territory. Geographically, Canada was simply right smack in the middle of all this. So the Americans came forward. Canada agreed to enter into agreements to build airfields, the Alaska Highway, an oil pipeline extending up into the northwest corner of the continent. Canadian government didn't have the resources to build these installations, even on its own territory. As a result, the US Corps of Engineers swept up to manage the task. By the end of 1942, more than 10,000 American personnel on Canadian soil, in many local areas, simply dwarfing the numbers of Canadian residents. And this had human and environmental impacts. Although the western subarctic looked unoccupied on Southerners' maps, of course the Northwest had been a homeland to Aboriginal peoples since time immemorial. Most of the Indigenous societies practiced a mixed economy, blending traditional subsistence lifestyles with fur trade opportunities. And despite their relative isolation from a southern standpoint, these cultures had already adapted to the presence of traders and miners, whalers, policemen, and the occasional bureaucrat who ventured up there for a short time. But the sudden influx of newcomers contracted to undertake these wartime construction projects was unprecedented, and certainly unprecedented since the gold rush. And their arrival was also unexpected. Amos Dick is a Cascadena elder in Ross River, Yukon. We were sitting at a tent and he was telling me the story about how as a young boy of about 13, he was out hunting in the bush near his community. Just out doing his own thing. All of a sudden he hears this tremendous noise, witnessed strange men crashing through his people's lands in their caterpillar tractors, building the Canol Road, completely unannounced to the local peoples. Now, we're fortunate in that historians like Ken Coates and Bill Morrison have done a great job of identifying some of the effects that these projects had on the Canadian Northwest. Right? For Native men, they had opportunities to undertake casual work, unloading supply trucks, providing meat for work crews. Native women worked in laundries, cafes, and cookhouses. Short-term boom in terms of native craft industry. Reality was long-term employment was seldom open to native residents along this new transportation network. Now, soldiers and construction crews, following on a long process of colonization unintentionally, brought diseases with them for which residents had no local natural immunity. Epidemics swept through a lot of these native communities, leading to soaring death rates during the war years. And while the Alaska Highway improved access to fish and game in the southern Yukon, resources upon which southern Yukon native people subsisted, now it was non-natives who were up competing for these resources, so there were increasing pressures. And the highway also meant more government scrutiny and control, including a stronger police presence, more pressure for children to attend schools, including residential schools. So the impacts of militarism, what I'm trying to get across, extended beyond the exigencies of the war itself. And they weren't confined to the Northwest. Project Crimson was conceived to go and ferry short-range fighter aircraft from America, where they were built, all the way over to England. So meteorologists began to build weather stations in the Eastern Arctic, and then to build airfields, which were stepping stones over to Europe. And these projects initiated a process of military modernization that culminated during the 1950s. Frobisher Bay, we know it now as Iqaluit, right, the capital of Nunavut, was a temporary fishing spot for Inuit of southern Baffin Island, but up to this point, never had there been a settlement there. It had never been a trading post. Its first permanent incarnation was Crystal 2, which was an air base and a weather station at the head of the bay and one of the stops on this Crimson route. So effectively a small town that grew up overnight with almost every conceivable amenity, and the exposure to Western life had an impact that was very transformative on all of these local inhabitants. Tomasi Neglingnik encountered the Americans in 1941 when they first arrived in Frobisher Bay to find a location to build houses in an airfield. Quote, "The Kalunat, the non-Inuit, started giving us biscuits and sugar, tea, chocolate, and Coca-Cola," he recalled, followed by cigarettes, and then modest wage employment. As the quote on this slide suggests, movies were a completely new phenomenon for Inuit, right? Provoking fear, but also fascination. And the arrival of the Americans during the war marked a turning point in the history of the region. Right before the war, the only Kalunat, the only non-Inuit that Neglingnik's family had seen were Hudson Bay Company employees. They'd never seen mechanized vehicles like bulldozers. Quote, "When they started unloading the ship, their vehicles just started moving on the ground, even though they were made of metal," he recounted. "Looking back, we must have thought they were from the moon." Suffice to say, the air war drew the Arctic and subarctic onto the military map like nothing before, and also catapulted the North onto the national political agenda. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King was absolutely paranoid that American developments in the remote Northlands, undertaken in the name of military security, would undermine Canadian sovereignty. And he listened to Vincent Massey, who was then High Commissioner over in London, warning, look, the Americans are going to waltz in and, quote, treat us like a docile band of Aborigines. I mean, the language was very telling. The government set up a military commissioner to oversee the defense projects, paid off the Americans when the war was over to ensure that the ownership of the sites that the Americans built in the Northwest was unquestionably Canadian. So what was ironic was that the United States had set the development agenda on the basis of security concerns, and Canada had supported it, even if just symbolically, for sovereignty reasons. There were no longer-term legal ramifications, but there were social and political effects, as I mentioned, when the Northwest receded from the political spotlight at the end of the war. Now, after the war, of course, the geostrategic focus turned from the Northwest to the Canadian Arctic more generally. And when the idea of a Cold War set in, decision makers in Washington and in Ottawa began to haul out now brand new forms of maps, polar projection maps, right, looking at the world from the perspective of the North Pole, usually things they pulled out of a 1942 version of National Geographic magazine. Now, Canada was, of course, sandwiched between the two superpowers. And the United States immediately raised the possibility of a Soviet attack over the pole. So the link between the defense of northern Canada and the security of the North American heartland was now very clear. So it's not that the North was some place to be defended because it had some intrinsic value. It was simply seen as a strategic approach, right? It's an exposed front. It's a military space. It's not seen as a place of value. So the US military soon returned to the Arctic to build airfields and weather stations. Sheila, I think this map is out of your book, so thanks for letting me use it. Lower-end stations popped up in various locations, places like Kittigaziwit, where Inuvialuit men like Joe Teddy were hired to drive tractors and maintain the ice airstrip. Quote, getting everything. Every 2 weeks they give us rations, eh? Joe recalled. He and his wife Mary lived in tent frames built using wood from the garbage dump. Other Aboriginal people hired by the Royal Canadian Air Force fixed up log cabins that had been built by reindeer herders back in the 1930s, lived in them until this station shut down. The Air Force would fly in, airdrop fresh foods, beef, bananas, apples, oranges, Coca-Cola, which seems to appear in every one of these narratives. Right? Those of you who've studied Europe after the war, there's talk about Coca-Colonization. Same thing was going on in the Canadian North, even uniforms being dropped in. There was no time for hunting or trapping given the work schedule, but the Inuvialuit workers would go out on Sundays for fresh air and canoe rides and enjoy these nightly movies after their shifts ended. But drawing Northerners into these projects also brought them into focus for government protection. A telling case related to African Americans. African American units, to be more precisely, which the United States proposed to use to build these northern installations after the war. Now the problem was, African Americans were accused of spreading venereal disease, sexually transmitted diseases, in the Mackenzie district during the war. The idea was, dirty African American men, right, a classic trope in American scholarship, looking back at that time, African American men were blamed for racial reasons for bringing STD. They had the highest rates of STD in the US Army and they were targeted. During the war, however, this came into contact with a narrative that it was Aboriginal women in the North, Métis women, First Nations women who were responsible for spreading diseases. During the war, this was sort of shuffled over. But after the war, this whole gender responsibility for VD took on new significance. Canadian officials decided to use the idea of the dirty African American as the reason to keep segregated battalions out of the Canadian North. And if the occasional African American man did come up, they were very carefully monitored. Quote, we were told that the black people were unruly and that we females should be scared of them, Martha Michael, a young girl living in Frobisher Bay in 1948, recalled. All of the Inuit women from the community were moved to an island called Iqaluit, while African American soldiers worked on the airstrip that summer. At that time, we went through a real tough time, Michael noted. We Inuit did not have control over our lives anymore. Now, whether the Inuit had control over their lives was far less of a preoccupation for Canadian officials than their fear of embarrassment for, quote, not being sufficiently careful in protecting the welfare of natives. Or conversely, they were paranoid about being put in a politically or diplomatically intractable position by rejecting these African American units. Canada didn't want to look like it was being racist. Now, the desegregation of the US Armed Forces in the years just after this removed the issue. But this particular situation revealed how racial categories factored very much into decision making. Right? The image of the dirty Aboriginal woman being replaced with that of African American men, soldiers threatening the health of Aboriginal Canadians. What this did, of course, was absolve white society of responsibility for introducing VD to the North in the form of whalers in contact before this. And it also allowed Canadian policymakers to focus their energies on grappling with the need to ensure that their Aboriginal people were safe under the paternalistic protection, of course, of the great white father in Ottawa. So what about Canada more generally? Was it content to be safe under the paternalistic protection of Uncle Sam? Right? Did Canada have the resources to defend its north by itself to the satisfaction of the US? Obviously we did not. But we also couldn't allow the Americans to undertake this long polar watch by themselves on Canadian territory because we'd be admitting that our sovereignty was weak. So the concept of defense against help is really key to understanding Canada's Cold War Arctic strategy. Decision makers recognized that the US, in the process of guaranteeing Canada's security, could end up itself becoming our primary sovereignty threat. So if Canada wasn't willing or able to defend its northern approaches to the satisfaction of the US, the Americans would be forced to do whatever they wanted, regardless of what Canada's preferences were. So Canada faced a dilemma. I think historian David Berkison explained it succinctly and best. How could we protect the continent against the Soviet Union, something we could not do alone, while at the same time protect our northern sovereignty from the United States? A dilemma perhaps still with us today. Well, the Canadian government was unwilling to go and station large numbers of combat troops in the north. They wanted much more inexpensive solutions. One option was having paratroopers based down south who could be flown up to the north in the unlikely scenario of a Russian attack. What would happen while they were in transit? Once they got up there, how would they know where to go, right? These are people without the skills. Well, the military recognized, of course, that having eyes and ears on the ground in northern and remote areas made sense. So in 1947, it established a very peculiar volunteer force called the Canadian Rangers. The idea was northern residents know their homeland very well. So they'd be able, with limited training, to hold off a potentially dangerous enemy invader and at least hold them off until the regular forces arrived, in which case they could be guided and scouted by these northerners. How do you equip them? Not with the latest military hardware. Give them an old Lee Enfield rifle, vintage sort of First World War, a couple hundred rounds of ammunition a year, no uniforms. They're going to dress whatever's appropriate for their local conditions. Just give them an armband to show that they're in the military. Don't give them much training or direction. It seemed to be a recipe born of brilliance in Ottawa because it barely cost anything. Soon the Rangers extended throughout the far north. Inuits and other northerners looked to the skies and seas to report any strange activities and also train the military when it came up into their homeland. As for the rifles and ammunition, there's no reports apart from the occasional shot maybe taken at a Russian submarine, maybe an American one, who knows. All the hunters talk about is the ping that they heard when it hit this supposed whale. The idea was, Rangers, go out and hunt, use your rifle and ammunition, bring home caribou and seal to feed your families, and everybody wins. There seems to be a reciprocal benefit. And the Rangers and other northern residents trained southern troops who ventured north in their winter warfare training, taught them how to build shelters like here in Cambridge Bay, where the elders still recall the great city of igloos that the soldiers would build on the bay just alongside the community. Right? While the threat estimates of an actual danger to the Canadian North remained modest, this tempo, this scale seemed appropriate. But by the early 1950s, once the Soviets developed atomic and then thermonuclear weapons, the consequence of an attack from the air grew exponentially. And the US deterrence strategy was based on the premise that you needed to have a retaliation force that could blast the Soviets into oblivion. Right? In order to get your bombers up in the air to retaliate, you need to have advance warning. So Canada was under the US strategic umbrella. We thought this logic made sense. So accordingly, the lion's share of our defense budget now flowed towards the Royal Canadian Air Force. And the new hum was that of science, dedicated to try and find ways to build radar lines to give you as much advanced warning of a Soviet invasion. You're not going to look to human surveillance like Rangers. It's not seemed to be enough. So the Arctic is huge. It's very, very big. Great big buffer. Use it to strategic advantage. So the distant early warning line, more popularly known to all of us as the DEW line, was built along the 70th parallel between 1955 and 1957 to detect Soviet bombers. I mean, that's an amazing 3-year period when you look at the scale of this project, done as a real crash course. Its creation an extraordinary feat of geographical engineering, planned and sequenced in the minutest of details, whether it's at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology or Bell Laboratories down in New Jersey. It dramatically altered the military, the demographic, the logistical characteristics of the Canadian Arctic. Now, the US agreed to pay for this whole thing. And journalists and the political opposition suggested, like they always seem to do, that the real story here was that this was going to undermine Canadian sovereignty. That this was going to cost us our Northland and that we were going to become the world's most northerly banana republic. Well, Well, once again, Canadian negotiators did what they'd done for decades, sat down and worked out a favorable agreement that, if nothing else, protected our sovereignty and made sure there were spin-off benefits for the Canadian high-tech industry. So sovereignty is secure. But there were side effects. Now, Canadian decision makers in their hubris naively believed that they could insulate northern Indigenous peoples from the impacts of these mega projects. Right? They talk about the Inuit as though they're in this primitive state of social development and in need of protection from these outside forces. Such is the arrogance of military modernism. The notion that the state can control environments and people and the interactions between them. Well, reality proved very, very different. Changes were subtle. They were unopposed by Inuit. Right? The idea of a totalizing state forcibly relocating Indigenous populations to serve a liberal agenda. Right? Fashionable arguments in the literature these days. Right? Frank Tester, Peter Krolczewski sort of arguments. What's remarkable is this is largely absent from the narratives, the archive material, and the oral histories of Inuit from this particular time. It was much more benign inducements and relationships that sucked people into the vortex of this military modernization. Right? The DEW line served as sites for cross-cultural interaction. Obviously a staged photograph just for fun for the cameras, right? But it had a major impact on northern peoples. Until the 1950s, the vast majority of Inuit still lived as hunters, supplementing this lifestyle with limited trapping income, but for the most part self-sufficient, existing outside of mainstream capitalist society. Now they're encountering Western culture in different ways than they had with the Hudson Bay Company and the missionaries and the sprinkling of government officials who occasionally ventured up into the region. In the late 1950s, DEW line construction and the few operational jobs provided many Inuit with wage labor for the first time. And although the number of Inuit men actually employed on the line at any given time was pretty small, right? Never more than about 100. When you look at the relatively small population of the North and the effects that wage labor had on extended family activities, the magnitude was much broader and much more significant than these small numbers might lead us to suggest. And as Inuit and Athabascan groups began to congregate around these DEW line sites, the first incipient urbanization in the North took place. For people who didn't have easy access to wood, right, you're above the tree line, or metal, the DEW line garbage dumps were very attractive business, right, providing you with food. Not food that's gone bad and spoiled by any northern standard, just there was too much of it for the crews at these DEW line sites to actually consume. Building supplies that you couldn't go and acquire in the Arctic tundra. So settlements like Tuktoyaktuk and Cambridge Bay literally grew up around these DEW line sites. In turn, the migration of workers and their families to these sites influenced Indigenous lifestyles and cultural dynamics. Right? Jobs may have been temporary, but the effects were profound. And if an Inuk hunter, an Inuk man, is not using his equipment for a year or two, the equipment's no longer usable in the future. Furthermore, a DEW line job would pay on average 7 times more than that of the average trapper's income. And Inuit who lived on the line also got permanent housing, and they thus weren't anxious to return to their previous migratory lifestyle. And for women who had access to material goods, who often had to head off to the dump to feed their children while their husbands ate in the DEW line mess halls, found their traditional roles disrupted. So again, I can get into more details and questions if you're interested, but the DEW line really thrust the Arctic into Canadian political consciousness. But the emphasis was hardly on northern peoples, who were affected by this mega project, but were never consulted on it. Right? It changed northern life irrevocably. But like most projects conceived to deal with security crises, the DEW line's relevance also passed very quickly. It's built as this technological triumph of terror. No, it wasn't the Death Star, but so you get the Star Wars reference there, right? But once the Soviets managed to spit Sputnik up into space, and the space race was on, the DEW line all of a sudden seemed less relevant. Yes, Inuit and other northerners continued to work for the DEW line, but it's certainly fair to say that they influenced the military a lot less than it influenced them. Now, northerners continued to play a more direct role in defense as it was through the Rangers, quietly going on with their existence, but largely in theory. By 1960, Captain Ambrose Shea liaison officer responsible for the Rangers in the Eastern Arctic, complained that the basic message he had received from Ottawa was that the Rangers may exist, but under no circumstances can they do anything. Never did the Rangers understand their role, or even understand the Southern concept of soldiering, as you get a sense of from the quote on the slide. Right? Useful friends on the ground, keenly interested in this Ranger organization, who took their roles very seriously. In one extreme case, they'd been told to watch for enemy ships. Weird ship they didn't recognize the patterning on it, had some stars on it. They mistakenly assumed to be a Soviet ship. They went and one Inuk actually tried to board the ship and take them prisoner. Turns out it was a US Coast Guard cutter, the Staten Island. So thankfully he didn't do anything more dramatic than that. This is not what officials had intended for the Rangers. But however imperfectly the Rangers, or the military for that matter, understood the Rangers' role, Shea still saw a place for them. Quote, the idea of arming a local population and asking them to take a hand in defending their own locality is an ancient one and eminently sensible, he argued. It doesn't become outdated even in this atomic age. And he recognized that their modest contributions underlined a relationship between the military and Northerners. He likened the Ranger rifle to equivalent to an engagement ring. But if this was the case, the military's romance with the North and with the Rangers seemed to be over by the 1960s. Right? Just as the DEW line became operational, Sputnik indicated that there were new strategic delivery systems, intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, pushed NORAD, this other creation between Canada and the US, to focus less on static radar lines, instead to focus on satellite technologies, much more versatile. And they don't need land. They don't need land. They allow Canada to wiggle out of its primordial concern about sovereignty. So the Canadian Arctic is no longer considered to be a key strategic theater. The North American air defense system slips to the back burner. The Navy stopped going north. The Army stopped doing exercises. Canadian Rangers were virtually abandoned, left to wither on the vine. The government's focus shifted for a very short time to the north as a resource frontier, right? John Diefenbaker, wonderful shaking jowls up there on the stump, proclaiming his great northern vision. Northern vision, though, that had little space for northern peoples, right? His preoccupation was on the benefits that northern resources could bring to southern Canadians. Really, at the end of the day, his northern vision was a national economic plan. But like most northern policies, his vision was much bolder than his resolve to actually implement his ideas. And the Canadian public pretty much lost interest in this northern vision by the late 1960s. But early 1970s, Canadians have a new surge of interest in the Arctic thanks to our American friends, not behaving so friendly in our eyes. 1969, right, the American supertanker, the Manhattan, transiting the Northwest Passage to test how feasible it is to carry oil from the North Slope of Alaska around to energy-hungry eastern seaboard of the US. Well, Canada said, hey, wait, we're not comfortable with this. We're not going to state it outright, but we consider the Arctic waters, the waters between our Arctic islands, to be Canadian internal waters. They belong to us just as much as Lake Simcoe or Lake Scugog does. Right? We can control everything that goes on in them. The US disagreed and disagrees today and says, no, it's an international strait. It's maybe never been used for commercial transit, but the fact that it can be because it connects two bodies of ocean, high seas, means our legal position is clear. It's an international strait. Like, this is still the heart of our disagreement with the Americans on the status of these waters today. Well, journalists, yeah, were concerned about that, but they were more concerned about this American tanker smashing through Arctic waters. What did this mean now for our custodial responsibilities in the north? Right? What if this supertanker like this ran aground along the Northwest Passage? Canadian scientists said an accident like this in the Arctic Ocean would be catastrophic. Right? An emotionally charged Canadian public, developing a green consciousness, right, in the late 60s for the first time, eats this stuff up. So politicians got the message. Now they began to talk about the idea of a delicate Arctic. Right now is an important place that needs to be protected. Right? The decision to frame foreign, particularly American activities as a threat to Canada, violating our territorial integrity, jeopardizing Northerners' human right to live in a wholesome natural environment, allowed the government to adopt extraordinary means to protect its environmental interests. And this also gets translated, as these things usually do, even though there's no military threat posed by the Americans, quite the opposite, of course. It gets gone and plunked into a new approach to defense, a new policy statement in 1971 saying that sovereignty Protecting Canadian national interest was the primary goal of the Canadian forces. It means there was now a Northern Region military headquarters created in Yellowknife. Naval vessels again went north on northern deployments annually. Patrol aircraft now flying patrols over the Northwest Passage. The Army begins to go back north once again. Virtually every component of the Canadian forces is involved in northern area during the 1970s. Right? Not because there was a security threat, because there was a sovereignty threat, but this is a way that the politicians could show they were taking visible action. Well, even the Canadian Rangers, right, who'd been left to atrophy, were now revitalized. I would say half-heartedly. The military really wanted to recruit Inuit and other northern people into the regular forces. They wanted to make them into real soldiers. So one after another, they tried to implement a Northern Native Entry program. All of it proved a dismal failure. And this ended up, I would argue, being much better for the North. Historian Ken Eyre anticipated later in the 1970s, it didn't make sense to try and recruit away the most educated and disciplined residents living in northern communities. Right? These are the individuals who you need to assume the leadership in the changing North. And he argued, I think very far-sightedly, that these are the people who benefit Canada best by staying in their communities rather than being assimilated into the military and being deployed abroad. And ironically, defense planners at the time did not recognize that the Rangers, however peculiar and modest they were as a military organization, had all the right ingredients for a very positive, successful relationship. And they very much fit with the changing North, right? Some of us have studied, or some of us will remember Thomas Berger and his landmark report coming out of the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline discussions, version 1, talking about the North, not just as a resource frontier, but also amplifying for Southern audiences that the North is a homeland. Native people in the 1970s being much more vocal and saying, we're not going to sit on the sidelines anymore. Our voices must be heard and our land claims must be settled. So sovereignty had internal dimensions as well. And government officials, for a short time at least, seemed to internalize the message from the Department of Foreign Affairs, External Affairs at the time, that at its core, sovereignty doesn't require a certain military set piece. Sovereignty is about governance. It's not about token flag planting. It's not about symbolism. And this really killed any major investment in Arctic defenses from being carried through. And after all, the Americans abandoned their oil transportation plans, the US threat to Canadian sovereignty subsided, and this meant that Ottawa lost interest in the region because those resources looked like they were less and less accessible. So Canadian interest and the Canadian forces' presence declined almost as soon as it began, right? Until 1985. Sovereignty issue again returns with a vengeance, right? Another American vessel, this time a US Coast Guard icebreaker, decides to push through the Northwest Passage, completely practical reasons to resupply their base at Thule and Greenland, right? They came and asked the Canadian Coast Guard, look, Canada, one of our ships in dry dock, we can't get it out, we needed this to go and resupply. Can you do it for us? Canada said, no, we don't have any of our Coast Guard vessels available for you to use. You're going to have to do it. Okay, we didn't ask you permission because we're going to preserve the sanctity of our legal position. Canada said, yeah, we grant you permission really quietly through the Coast Guard. They think it's all worked out. Until Franklin Griffiths, those damn political scientists, right? No, he was great. Identified this and said, this has potential implications for Canadian sovereignty. Look, everybody in Canada, wake up to all of this here. Academics, opposition politicians, Inuit spokespersons suggested this undermines Canada's legal position and our ownership of these waters. Suddenly, a relatively benign matter is transformed into another political crisis. And External Affairs Minister Joe Clark's statement on sovereignty encapsulated the growing concern. And it's really telling, marks the changing times, because look at the prominent place of an Inuit and Northern peoples in his message. It is a striking quote. The indivisibility of the Arctic land and sea and ice. That just because it looks blue on our simple maps, because it's water, doesn't mean that it's not usually in a frozen state and therefore impassable and a unique ecosystem. That Inuit people and their historic use of the islands and the Arctic Ocean since time immemorial were central to Canada's sovereignty. And that, of course, the implicit message the Canadian government is going to stand up for Canada when it's challenged by those pesky Americans. So in the wake of the Polar Sea, the Conservative government took various steps to consolidate Canada's legal position officially drawing straight baselines around all of our Arctic islands, saying that everything within our internal waters, as much ours, like I said, as Lake Scugog, and anything within these lines subject to full Canadian control, just like land territory would be. Enough? Oh no, of course. It also means that a sovereignty challenge is a pretext to invest in security. The government revived military operations in the north, upgraded northern airfields for fighter aircraft, promised to go and do fixed subsurface arrays at choke points along the Northwest Passage to detect foreign submarines, most of which were going to be American, of course, and probably covered by some secret bilateral agreement. But no, we need to do something to protect and know what's going on. Promised to build a Polar 8 class icebreaker, biggest icebreaker in the world, to patrol our waters all times of the year. And 1987 white paper, the government even says Canada's going to acquire 8 to 12 nuclear-powered submarines to patrol our waters to prepare against who? So the Conservative government's energized. You've got a sovereignty crisis, you're going to do things, military in the north, defense capabilities. Again, no time for dialogue with Northerners, right? Because there's an existential threat to Canada posed by our best friend and ally and their nasty icebreaker. Okay, well what about Northerners in all of this? Well, beginning in the 1970s, scholars like Nils Orvik began to broaden definitions of security and sovereignty to accommodate Northern people's interests and values, saying that this old model that was uniformly state-centric, focused almost entirely on military aspects of problems and military solutions was no longer fitting. He began to gesture towards what we now call today environmental security and human security, suggesting that these were the real definitions of security that we should be embracing in the North. So in an era of land claims, growing Aboriginal self-awareness in political terms, policymakers couldn't ignore the impacts that defense strategies had on Northern peoples. So they had to take this into account. And in the late 1980s, low-level flying controversies, environmental concerns, very public appeals by Aboriginal leaders to demilitarize the North invariably expanded the debate about security. Writing in 1986, George Erasmus, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, saw, quote, "No military threat in the Canadian North, only a threat to the cultural survival of Indigenous peoples posed by military buildup." Right, the then president of the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, now Council, Mary Simon, drew similar parallels between military activities, quote, justified by the government on the basis of defense and military considerations that often serve to promote our insecurity as Northerners. And Inuit ties to the environment and to a collective social order meant that for them, security had to include environmental, economic, cultural, and defense aspects. Right? An alternate, unofficial security discourse, one that bypassed the integrity of the nation state to focus on the protection of essential group and individual rights. And interesting, because these are the same ideas. I co-chaired a conference last week through this Monk Gordon Arctic Peoples and Security Program. The same messages coming out of Inuit saying you need to be reminded of these ideas, that it's all connected, and that we need to change the way we package ideas like security and sovereignty to take into account what our real interests and issues are on the ground. Well, how did this shifting discourse influence the Canadian military in the North? Well, if defense projects in the past had been implemented with little input or opposition from Aboriginal groups, this was no longer the case. I talked, remember, about Canada and defense against help. Right now, Aboriginal groups began to suggest that Northern residents may need protection from Canadian military activities, right? That they needed to protect themselves from Canadian help. And when the national and local agendas conflicted, like they did over low-level flying at Goose Bay in the 1980s, they created a lot of political and public controversy. Canada wanted to go and expand NATO flying activities in Labrador and eastern Quebec. Right? They said there's a very low population density. There are Innu people, Montagnier Naskapi and Inuit people as well in this area, but it's much more attractive because it will be much less disruptive to them than it would be to European populations if we tried to do this over in Europe. Well, the provincial government and a lot of non-Aboriginal communities thought that this would bring a windfall of jobs and money into what was an economically depressed region. But the Innu and their supporters saw this as a threat to their way of life, that this air training disrupted their traditional practices, stymied their attempts to try and nurture their communities back to health. First, This jet noise, they said, endangered human health, threatened to deafen community members, right? Planes flying over camps. The startle effect on children and elders who were clutching their chests. The Innu began to talk about the predatory sexual inclinations of transitory airmen who would come in greater numbers and prey on their young women, claimed a veto to protect their inalienable Aboriginal rights so long as their land claims were outstanding. In their view, rampant militarization threatened land and animals, and it posed an existential danger to their way of life, culturally, spiritually, materially. And they said, low-level flying has effects that only we can see on the ground. It's not some empty space that you can fly over, right? It's a space, it's a place that we know intimately. Well, Innu occupations of runways and bombing ranges continued into the early 1990s. 1990, of course, troublesome year. Collapse of the Eastern Bloc, good thing perhaps. Aboriginal government friction over Meech Lake and armed confrontation between the Mohawks and soldiers at Oka really pushed Goose Bay out of the national headlines. And the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War really sounded the death knell for expansion plans at Goose Bay, which was cancelled in 1990 as an expansion. So we've got this low-level flying debate. But then quietly, in the same space, you've got a stark contrast when we look at the Canadian Rangers. Right, here's a situation where you have Inuit Rangers in Labrador serving quietly as members of the Canadian Forces at this very time. Right, here's an Inuk Ranger from Postville butchering caribou in his Ranger sweatshirt during a training exercise. And although pro-military advocates critiqued traditional Aboriginal activities in the land, right, when it came to the Innu, seeing them as being disruptive, getting in the way of proper progress, jobs, more military training, these same people held up Inuit, First Nations, and Métis Rangers as essential guides, survival instructors, by virtue of that same native knowledge and intimate contact with the land, right? The very thing that the Innu were claiming were essential to maintain for their way of life. All very ironic and quite a complicated mix. Also ironic that the Canadian Rangers continued to grow after most of the Northern Defence projects proposed by the Mulroney government were scrapped. Right, during the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War, the North and the Canadian Forces activities in the North underwent another period of chronic decline. Just about every promise that Mulroney had made, the nuclear submarines, a high Arctic base, polar-class icebreaker, so on, were retracted. Only a modernization of the DEW line into a North warning system and the expansion of the Canadian Rangers were actually carried out. And the Rangers underwent very dramatic growth in the years ahead, particularly in Aboriginal communities. Now, why then? Well, because they were already there. People already lived in communities, and that made them very inexpensive. Also, because it's very positive to have a force comprised largely of Canadians who see themselves as very, very patriotic, I might add, showing the flag for Canada's partners, right? Not hostile Mohawks in camouflage clothing claiming distinct sovereignty, right? Not Innu protesting low-level flying, patriotic Canadians serving in the military in this very unorthodox unit. So a very positive relationship that remarkably had stood the test of time. And I'd argue it was precisely because so little funding had been placed in the Rangers, and therefore the government did so little in terms of commanding and trying to control on the ground these organizations, that the Rangers evolved as what is truly a grassroots organization that allowed people to serve their home communities as much as they're serving the military, and allowed them to be patriotic Canadians and patriotic Aboriginal people simultaneously without people going and asking for clarification. It worked out its own logic on the ground. And what this meant is that by the start of the 21st century, almost every community in the Arctic that could sustain a Ranger patrol had one. You have this publicly and politically marketable military success story that on the one hand a government can go and appropriate to go and send its own message. At the same time, people on the ground say, this is community building, you're merging traditional and human security considerations in the Canadian North, our communities are benefiting, we're all winning, and the Liberals said we love it because it's cheap. Anyways, fit the government agenda of the 1990s and early 21st century. I mean, the Liberals, of course, adopted a very different discourse than their predecessors, one of diplomacy, one of governance, one of long-term human capacity building when it came to circumpolar affairs. right? Department of Foreign Affairs focused on developing new multilateral institutions like the Arctic Council, focused on human and sustainable development. What was key was that in the late 1990s, in the absence of a sovereignty crisis, you have space to accommodate broader definitions of security. Environmental, cultural, human dimensions can all come together. Not a guns and warship approach. Modest government activities, the creation of a position of an ambassador for circumpolar affairs, indicated that northern perspectives were now going to be central to charting a future course. So what changed this? There was no direct challenge to our sovereignty in the late 1990s. There hasn't been one in the last decade. But defense officials and public commentators began to conjure up potential threats. And you look at each one individually, and they look rather innocuous. They look like they can actually be managed. But put them together, and Rob Hubert, primary purveyor of polar peril, to borrow Franklin Griffith's phrase, said, it's really scary. A perfect storm is gathering in the north, and we Canadians, apathetic as we are, have lost sight of what the real challenges are. Yes, the Cold War is over, but that means the Arctic is now that much more vulnerable because more people can be operating in the region. The issues of international straits and the status of waters, the classic sovereignty debate, is not gone. And in fact, the number of maritime activities are increasing. The subs are still prowling around up there, right? American and Russian and maybe French, who knows? Furthermore, we've got cruise ships going up in numbers never dreamed of previously. You know, exponential growth. What if one of these cruise ships runs aground, as they have? And if we don't have the capability to go and actually retrieve the passengers, many of whom are going to be elderly, therefore, and not be able to withstand the rigors of the Arctic climate, does this mean that we're going to lose credibility and maybe our sovereignty by God? Race for resources we'll get to in just a moment, but the idea that all of a sudden the Arctic is this great big treasure chest. And once it's becoming more accessible, there's going to be this great lust for resources. Undefined boundaries. My God, this is the one part of the world that Canada doesn't have clarity. We're obsessed with mapism, as Bill Morrison once referred to it. You know, we love to see our maps and think that they're crisp lines. We don't have crisp lines. Oh my God, what happens with undefined boundaries? Holy smokes, look what happens in the Middle East. Look what happens with Israel. Oh my gosh, things get out of hand. And post 9/11, you have to have terrorism in, right? Why not see the Arctic as the soft underbelly to get to the rest of North America because it's undefended? And then why not say put it all together? We know what happens when oil and gas are thrown into the mix with the Americans, right? Interstate conflict. All of a sudden, it looks pretty terrifying. Our sovereignty, we were told, is on thinning ice. That as the ice melts, so too will our claim to the Arctic. But why? Right? There's no immediate Russian or American threat. The Americans are more apathetic than they are activist in the Arctic. And the Russians stand to gain the most in the circumpolar world if everything unfolds according to international law, because the lion's share of resources are comfortably within their jurisdiction. What then is this cause of this paranoia? Well, unfortunately, because Southern Canadians have not had a sustained interest in the North, because we haven't had a continuous dialogue with Northerners, we're susceptible to alarmism that lacks context. Right? And I'm a historian, so my life is all about putting things in context. The real issue at play is climate change. Right? You've heard in other talks here and in class, the science is very clear that big things are happening. Whether it's science from traditional knowledge holders in communities or scientists operating out of universities or government offices. It's clear that the Arctic is warming at a greater rate than anywhere else on Earth. And we've all heard pessimists predict that the absence of ice could lead other countries to come and undermine our sovereignty over the Northwest Passage, that if it becomes navigable year-round and can be more safely traversed, that of course the world is going to come and plow their way through, with no regard for Canada's internal waters position, right? What does that mean? Naval capabilities. You need to be able to defend. And this seemed to be exactly how the Harper government in its early years really talked about the Arctic file by adopting a security strategy that masqueraded in some ways as a sovereignty or northern strategy. This came clear in their 2005 election platform, adopting this language of crisis, the need for a Canadian action with a particular emphasis on military forces, right? Really a throwback to the Mulroney era, with this common refrain of use it or lose it. I mean, offensive message for Northerners in particular, like, what do you mean use it? Like, we've been up here for millennia here, thank you very much. And the lawyers all go nuts in foreign affairs and say, lose it? What self-respecting country in the world would tell the world that there's a possibility it's going to lose something that's already its? Like, this is preposterous. But some young staffer maybe in the Prime Minister's office thought it was a catchy phrase and it took hold. It was also a very good way, of course, to differentiate the government from the Liberals. A belief that the Liberals had swung the pendulum too far over to diplomacy and human development, right? That the Conservatives had to make a corrective. It had to be more about defense and resource development. So this led to a spate of military commitments, all told, that would give Canada appropriate capabilities to assert its control over the Arctic. The one key thing to take out of this, a lot of these promises were absolutely necessary. These are capabilities that have been allowed to just disintegrate over preceding decades because no government wanted to do the long-term investment without the immediate payoff. Nothing wrong with these. The issue I have in some ways is with the packaging. By suggesting that this investment somehow bolstered or improved our legal sovereignty position is a different matter altogether. If our sovereignty is not in jeopardy, and if there is no conventional military crisis in the north, you want to make sure that you're justifying these because the Canadian forces are going to be our force of first resort, because they're the only ones who can do things in the region responding to safety issues. What did all this do in the early years? Certainly marginalize the diplomacy angle, right? But it fits. Crises can't wait for protracted solutions. You can't allow things to get bogged down into committee and have protracted negotiations. So a muscular stand up for Canada message emanated from Ottawa, certainly in the period up to about 2009. A lot of my American and European colleagues say how strange it is to see Canada adopting this chest-thumping role. You know, no, that's not our entire Canadian forces. I always tell them we do have more than that. But as members of the military say, that $1 million shot was something that was pretty stock imagery, right? Circa 2009. Critics say we should be looking for cooperation with our Arctic neighbors and building upon relationships that the military has built with Northerners since the Second World War. First off, use it or lose it, they say, is a misnomer. Our legal sovereignty is not predicated on having more boots on the ground. Inuits say boots on the ground. We've had mucklucks on the tundra for an awfully long time, thank you very much. Their message to Ottawa, use us. Use us. Historically, they remind decision makers, they've been disproportionately affected by sovereignty and security practices designed in Ottawa or Washington and imprinted on their homeland. Even if this has often been unintentional, they're understandably reticent about another round of what they see as a militarization of the agenda. And this plays out in really interesting ways. Right? Even when Canada sat down and negotiated a bilateral agreement with the Danes, right? Those nasty Danes. Remember what they did with Hans Island? Remember they were going to gobble up that little rock of a couple of football fields with no resources on it, with no implications for anything else? Became a real litmus test of Canadian resolve circa 2005. Yeah. Well, you know, the Danes aren't really that bad. They like their schnapps and they make some pretty neat cheese, so we can get along with the Danes. We sat down with our chiefs of defense staff and reached an agreement. What was interesting was that the immediate reaction, I was up in Alert, or Resolute, pardon me, when this was being signed, was that Mary Simon, who was the president of Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, was immediately critical of the military for not including the Inuit in the negotiations. I mean, on the one hand, we might say, God, does this mean that the military, even when it does something positive, is going to be chastised for being involved at all? We also had the Premier of Nunavut, Eva Ariak, you know, sort of murmuring some of those old critiques, the anti-militarism of the 1980s, at the same time. Or should we take this in a more positive light and say, this is an appropriate reminder that military actions do disrupt Northern people's lives, that you need to have Northerners present at these discussions, and that they need to be ensuring that sovereignty and security is proportionate to the local impacts that activities will have. One of the lessons of history that Northerners insist that Northerners should have a say in our Northern strategy because they're the people most affected by the changes. They've been marginalized historically. They're marginalized today when we adopt a crisis mentality that leaves no time for dialogue. Right? Is the threat the Russians? Is it Artur Chilangarov with that wonderful beard, you know, who went on his little mini sub and planted that titanium flag? The seabed at the bottom of the North Pole? Who've resumed bomber flights, who are modernizing their naval fleet, right? Their Bory class being, you know, this champagne across the bow a couple of weeks ago. Is the threat external? Or is it internal? Right? The cartoon that was published in Nunatsiaq News in August of 2009 during Operation Nanook. Amidst that multi-million-dollar military spectacle, there were 2 children that were found sleeping behind a dumpster outside of a local grocery store. A striking, visible, emotional way to raise questions about the government's priorities. Is the real crisis in the North the host of social and economic and health problems that are plaguing communities, right, that Inuit are very front and center about as being a priority? From an epidemic of suicides, to violent crime, to housing shortages, to homelessness. While Southern Canadians are aware of these potential sovereignty threats, we're much less aware of these host of issues. Does this imply that the money being invested in national defense is being misspent? Or is it simply an assertion that if you're going to invest money in defense, you can't do it at the expense of all of these other things that must also be balanced? That if we're prepared to talk about a crisis in this country, let's be sure we're getting the right crisis in front and center in our minds. So how or can the military expand its military footprint while minimizing the effect that it has on Northerners? Right? Sovereignty is not about borderlines on a map. It's about everything that goes on within those borders. A message I've been trying to state since 2006. Circumpolar Inuit Declaration, released a few years ago, reminds us sovereignty begins at home. Northerners are insistent that we need to put a human face on security to retain a sense of the Arctic as a place, not an exposed military front, not a resource frontier. And paying heed to this advice, in my mind, is the only way to avoid the up and down cycles that we've seen have characterized Canada's approach to the Arctic. You need sustained engagement. And perhaps everything is less dire than some commentators predict. There are other messages coming out of the Inuit community that also help to suggest that there is a positive angle to all of this. For example, coming out of the Kitikmeot region, Charlie Valak and Charlie Lyle appearing before a parliamentary committee in December 2010, for Inuit, an active military presence is very desirable. As long as it's based upon partnerships, this can continue. They even took the dew line and all the environmental damage that it caused to the North and said, you know, we're Inuit. We have a positive outlook in the world. We take things as they come. It's been a benefit because, you know, we've been front and center in terms of this cleanup. And in terms of that cleanup, it's helped us to create jobs in our communities. But you know what? We don't want to see that sort of cleanup being necessary into the future. So make sure the partnership is here and now. And we're working still for the military. We're supporting those North Warning Sites. These are jobs for us. And despite the fact that there's a lot of baggage associated with these projects, they say, military development and positive Inuit development, they say, can go hand in hand. The Rangers represent another aspect of partnership. Members of the military, members of communities at the same time, subject matter experts that are vital to military operations, and at the same time contribute to their communities and peoples in ways that cater to a broad definition of security. Right? From food security, as you heard about in the last lecture, to serving as a very interesting conduit for the transgenerational transfer of knowledge. I mean, it's bizarre to me, but through the Rangers, the military has actually become a widely praised mechanism for sharing knowledge between elders and youth. One of the needs identified in northern communities, we need opportunities, often expensive, to get young people out on the land, even if their parents don't have those land skills. We need to give them a chance to go out with elders to experience this. Well, who would have thought that it was the Canadian Forces, by going out and doing land activities, that would actually provide this celebrated occasion and opportunity quite regularly for young people to go out and learn from older people in ways that the communities say are completely culturally appropriate, that there's no appropriation of their cultures going on by the military. And it's something that they say they can celebrate because it's based upon trust, developed over decades and decades, and they say because the Rangers is the one continuous relationship that they've been allowed to nurture and develop. And the relationship that the Rangers embody is not a new one. Right? Our interest in sovereignty and security in this country, every generation, every 10 years or 12 years or so, we all of a sudden have this new interest, as though it's something that's brand new. Right? For Northerners, The most recent spasm of interest is but one in a long line of crises that have dramatically changed their homelands. One of my senior history colleagues recently told a former graduate student of mine who works on Arctic issues that history is becoming quite irrelevant. Historian saying this. Decision-making is future-oriented, he suggested. The changes in the Arctic mean that the past offers little guidance for the road ahead. Sheila will guess who that is. I disagree. So would most of the Northerners with whom I have traveled and spoken over the last decade. Their concerns about the future are framed by their past experiences, as should all of ours. And as they constantly remind me in the words and actions that they share, the Arctic is not just a space, it's a place populated by Canadians with long memories. And the one thing I try to impress upon the military, whether I'm embedded in Arctic response company groups, participant observation and exercises, or meeting with senior military officials is, you're going up to the north for the first time. Remember that you're entering into communities that have seen soldiers come and go, and for some of those elders, for the span of 7 or 8 decades. You have a lot to learn. You're the beneficiaries of trust because these are people who are able to see the good, even in the bad. The key is the patience is going to wear thin unless you prove these people that you actually have learned. Thank you very much.
Students from the geography department out this evening, and I had mentioned to students that perhaps had never actually met Dr. Lackenbauer before, but perhaps were familiar with his work, that there's probably very few pictures of him that exist that don't have him covered in frost. This evening he is not covered in frost. We took him down to Rio Gusto and warmed him up a bit before we brought him in to talk to you. I'm really pleased to have Whitney come and talk to us this evening. I've known Whitney for probably about 7 years. I mean, it's Winnipeg. 40 below. You were pretty frozen there too. And he's a wonderful colleague. He comes to us from St. Jeromes University, which is basically part of in the University of Waterloo. And he is he's an associate professor and the chair of the history department. So he comes with some sort of pretty weighty tailwind behind him. He's also the co-chair of the Monk School for Global Affairs in the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation for Arctic Peoples and for their Arctic Peoples and Security program. So he's a really busy guy. I don't think I've ever talked to Whit where he doesn't have too many things on his plate. I, in fact, have coerced him, and all of you students here should know that he's been coerced into going out after, maybe post-reception, for post-reception beer, if any of you would like to come, simply because it turns out he does not have to pull an all-nighter tonight, right? Something got canceled, and so you may have one night where you can get some, a couple hours sleep. But this is sort of indicative of the kind of life he leads. He's constantly in the field. He's a passionate, or writing about the field that he's been in. He's a passionate historian for the Canadian North. He's a prolific author. He's written, I won't even read the numerous books that he's written off, but I will plug his most recent, which is just the icing on the cake of a series, not just of books, but also of articles and numerous writings. And his most recent book that we're all really looking forward to is The Canadian Ranger, The Living History, because this is kind of all life's work for Whitney right now. It's part of his larger Canadian Rangers project. And all his work is exciting and interesting, but I think this, for me, certainly is one of the most interesting and exciting projects that he's done, because he's broken ground in this area of the Canadian Rangers and brought them to our attention. And in fact, we'll be talking about, I won't, give you any spoiler on his lecture tonight, which is really on the impact of the military on the Inuit, in which the Canadian Rangers program is part of. So, he is Canada's expert and authority in terms of a historian of the Canadian Rangers. And it's just an incredibly exciting body of work. But his, his current research in general includes Arctic sovereignty and security practices since the Second World War, histories of the Joint Arctic Weather Station program, and the distant early warning line, or the dew line, and also community-based histories in partnership with Indigenous peoples in the North and with heritage societies in the North. He's traveled extensively in the Canadian Arctic with the Rangers, but Whit told me he was almost killed just before this, so that's why he wasn't looking too happy. He got just missed by a water truck, right? If that water had spilled, if the truck hadn't got to the water, whatever, he would have been more frozen here. And he's certainly a passionate advocate for increased awareness of Arctic issues among Southern Canadians. In fact, we had a little chat earlier this week, and I was saying to Whit that I thought that, I'm just talking about what we're doing, that, I could see my sort of role as not necessarily influencing any Arctic policy, but certainly trying to educate people. And this is where you just jumped on the wagon. He was the other end of the phone, but I could just hear him, light up and say, but, that's what I do. This is, in a sense, what he's the most passionate about, is bringing really realistic and new and authentic visions and versions of the North, really authored by people in the North to Southerners so they can better understand. He also is, and I think this is really important, he's a true interdisciplinarian. He works across the board with everybody. I mean, I'm a geographer, Whit's a historian, a partner in crime is Robert Hubert, who of course you don't see eye to eye with, was a political scientist, but still between, political...
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Julia Harrison. I'm director of the Frost Centre for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies, and I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to the third talk in the North at Trent 2013 lecture series. It's been a very successful series, and it's a real pleasure to have Whitney Lackenbauer here as our final speaker for the series. I'd like to recognize a couple of people in the audience. Our VP External Relations, Julie Davis, has joined us this evening. The Dean of Graduate Studies, where are you, Joan? I can't say, there she is, she just walked in. Joan Sangster is here, and I would also like to make extend a special welcome to John and Sheila Grant, who are strong supporters of all that we do in the Frost Centre in Canadian Studies, and Sheila has also written on the area and the topic near and dear to tonight's lecture. So we'll be hearing from Sheila at the end, as she'll have a chance to thank Whitney at the end. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors, the Frost Centre for Canadian Studies and Indigenous Studies, the Roberta Bondar Fellowship Fund for Northern and Polar Studies, and our first speaker was the current Roberta Bondar Fellow, and the NIN Fund from the President's Office have all generously supported the series, and it's been a real success. I'd also like to say that this is the third North Lecture series that I have hosted and organized as director of the Frost Centre, and it will be my last, as I am stepping down as director at the end of June, but I really feel that it's been a real important contribution to the topic of Northern Studies at Trent, and it's been a real pleasure to be part of it. And this is a perfect talk to end this evening. I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Heather Nichol from the Department of Geography, and a close friend and associate and colleague of Whitney Lackenbauer, to introduce him tonight. It was Heather that first asked that we might invite Whitney to be an adjunct professor in the Frost Centre, which was, I think, is going to be a good relationship for us. So I'd like to invite Heather now to officially introduce Whitney.
You may not recognize this man in the room. I have mentioned him, and I'm so happy to see a lot of students.
Best suited to interviews, whether they're undertaken on the trail or in cabins, poring over maps and over coffee and the copious amounts of Coke and other pop that people drink up north, or of course while ice fishing. Here it's about 12:30 in the afternoon in Tuktoyaktuk in January, different times of the year. Or of course, munching on some raw seal, not just our former Governor General, right, who likes to eat the raw seal liver. For those of you who want to try it someday, it almost tastes like you're just drinking your bloody nose, but an interesting texture to you anyways. It's warm and fills you up with some warmth for sure. You know, in the other cases, going out and chatting with people while they're building snow houses. Igloos, obviously something very important. Heck, them even going and volunteering me to go spend a night alone in one of these, right? A loaded .303 rifle there in the cold trap, just in case a polar bear became curious and decided to pull its way in, but they told me they hadn't seen a polar bear there for years, so I was okay. And then saying to me, Whitney, you know, we're up here in the Arctic, and here's a little willow branch. Why do I need this? Well, you're sleeping in an Arctic. You need to wake up every couple of hours and poke holes in your igloo. Poke holes in an igloo? What do you mean? All I've got is a little tiny, you know, couple of survival candles, and that's it to warm this. And over the course of the night, it'll probably thaw out from the candles and can potentially freeze in, and you may suffocate. And people say to me, how did you know to wake up every couple of hours, Whitney? Tell somebody they're going to suffocate if they don't wake up every couple of hours, and I assure you I was on top of it. So people definitely setting me up for opportunities to witness firsthand the intersection between the official sovereignty agenda that's coming out of Ottawa and the realities on the ground for Northerners. And that's why I think the Canadian Rangers are a really fascinating way to jump in to my topic for tonight. Right? In the case of the Canadian Rangers, you have Northerners serving as reservists in the Canadian Forces, showing the flag for Canada. And on the one hand, we might celebrate their participation. Indeed, the residents of the 3 territories and the northern regions of the provinces, places like Nunavik and Nunatsiavut, serve in the Canadian Forces in rates far beyond Southern Canadians. It's really remarkable, about 7 times or 8 times the average of participation in our military, right? Despite the fact that we know the baggage of colonialism that's part of our nation's history. As the key military presence in the North, we might celebrate this grassroots organization as a representative and proportionate way to exercise our sovereignty and security. Or we might, as commentators like my friend Rob,
Scientists and historians and geographers and anthropologists.
International law.
Yes, international law. Yeah, absolutely. Just a true interdisciplinarian. And I think that really reflects his vision and his version of the Arctic and Northern studies. So I think we're really, really lucky to have him speak. I know we're in for a treat because Whitney's very high energy. We wouldn't feed him real coffee at dinner. He had to have decaffeinated. Goodness knows what would happen. And so I'm just looking, so forward to hearing you talk.
Well, thanks for the very overly generous introduction, Heather. Thanks to Julie as well for the kind invitation to deliver this talk as part of the North at Trent lecture series, sponsored by the Frost Center. Really great treat to be here, to be sure. And I've adjusted things up a bit. I mean, I was going to speak on almost more of a stock talk that I've given for the last few years on the intersection between sovereignty, security, and stewardship in the North. But I'm going to focus in on a little bit of a tighter topic tonight and use this opportunity to look at the intersection between Northerners' national defense and sovereignty. For those of us who follow the news, we'll understand how this fits within the logic of Stephen Harper and his government, how this is very much front and center with a lot of the imagery that we as Southern Canadians are consuming about the North. And I want to look at how that plays out historically. As Heather mentioned, over the last decade, I've been really blessed to spend a lot of time in the Canadian Arctic. And I think the most interesting part has been this work that I've done with the Canadian Rangers. I mean, I've been fortunate. I've literally got to travel with them from coast to coast to coast and to experience a distinction that some of the Rangers said to me, Whitney, some people travel to the North. You've got the opportunity to travel in the North. And there's a very different mindset that you come away with. Whether you're squishing through the boggy tundra, waking up on the shores of Hudson Bay, eastern shores in Inukjuak and Nunavik in northern Quebec, realizing that the Arctic isn't this realm of perpetual ice and snow, that in the summer, it's quite a colorful place. Bombing around on snowmobiles, when the state of water is frozen so it almost resembles land, right here on the Labrador Sea, off the coast of Labrador on the Atlantic, in the background with an island that looks like a great mountain to many of us. Realizing that the methodologies I use are often